Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video I'll be reviewing the adventure collection, the Bloodties Anthology Volume 1 Bloodstained, designed by Darren Kenny with Deep Breaths, Ana Paula Robiedo, Aaron Moon, Beth Ball, Cindy Butor, Daylight Productions, Hitten Dave, Jay Davidson, Shurgan, Hubert, Kai, Linder, Leanne Johnson, Milos Gowecki, and Tyler Mahoney. I apologize profusely for all the mispronunciations. I'm sure I had to do. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick R, Andy, Chris, Manuel, Basil, and Travis. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos Dade, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert 2B, Adam Tethers of Lion, Sam, Ross, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Scalenia, Nick C. Thank you all very much for your support. Bloodties is a nearly 300-page collection of 12, call them mini adventures. They're not quite adventures, but they are bigger than encounters or layers for the most part, usually ranging between a dozen pages and one of them up to about 40 pages, not including appendices, which this one has a lot of really good appendices. The theme here is, I guess, blood, which, equals horror. It's essentially mostly a collection of horror mini adventures, which horror is a very... It's a good genre to explore. Anytime you're an indie creator or a new creator, horror is, fear and uncertainty and unknown is one of the it's one of the easier emotions to instill upon others, I guess. It's a lot easier in comedy, for example, or in drama can be very difficult. But horror is kind of it's more universal, I think. We can all understand what scares each other. Everybody might have their own phobias, but in general, and when it comes to tabletop RPGs, you can capitalize on all of the different horror that's already out there, movies and literature and everything, and use that. And I think, if anything, tropes, while they can be tiresome when we're watching them in movies, are actually welcome when we're experiencing them in tabletop RPGs, because it's fun to be able to then explore that stuff. You recognize all these different tropes and these different kind of characters and these situations, and it's kind of fun to then explore, with your own persona and be able to interact with that stuff. So I think horror can be a very fun genre to use, which this is I think a pretty good collection for the most part. Not a whole lot of the adventures did I think were particularly incredible or amazing, but neither did I think that any of them were particularly horrible or bad. So it's a pretty baseline consistency, and I think the idea here is these are a lot of mostly newer creators, according to the DM's Guild page, which, if that's the case, this is incredibly impressive, because these are all well written. There weren't any big mistakes or errors or grammatical issues that I could find. They're very well organized, which is very impressive, and always something I'm looking at, which is, they've got the adventure synopsis clear in the front, which tells you, hey, this is what the adventure is. This is what you're going to encounter. Some of them even have adventure inspirations or themes, or what kind of things you're going to expect. Maybe a personas dramatis, which is you list the different characters, your cast of characters at the beginning. So you can tell, what are the important NPCs, and then having these very, very detailed appendices at the end where it lists all the stat blocks and the maps. All of the adventures come with maps, which is kind of nice, although it's kind of a double-sided coin, because on the one hand, I'm really thankful they all come with maps. On the other hand, the map art style is not one that I like, and if you've seen my reviews, that's something I have to repeat quite a few times. But they try to literally go with the blood as a theme for the art, and it doesn't look, it's all very dark and kind of muddy. It just doesn't end up looking too good, and we'll show you that. I don't think I'll be able to run through all 12 of these adventures, because I really want to try to keep these reviews to under 30 minutes if I can, and that's a lot of content. As I mentioned, this is almost 300 pages worth of adventures. I can highlight some of my favorite ones, and I can try to skim through the ones that I wasn't as excited about, but keep in mind, as I mentioned, I thought that the general quality was pretty high, which is good. It's very consistent quality, as I mentioned. None of them I thought were just absolutely incredible, but neither were they just like, ooh, this is bad. So even the ones that weren't necessarily my cup of tea, I at least could, read through them. I understood what was going on. I understood the themes and what was going for and all that. And I think the horror theme is very well used, with few exceptions. There are some that are more like you're going off on a exotic adventure somewhere. Two of them in particular that just didn't feel like they actually captured the horror theme the way the others actually did. And maybe even three of them. I think the first one actually is a little more adventure as well. It's a little more Pirates of the Caribbean, which is by Skull and Crone's Breath. This one is a little too linear. It's basically just a series of encounters as you hunt down a missing person, which is the leader of this town, and eventually have to fight this night hag battle. There's a really cool, it's actually a pretty cool boss fight though, with a giant, the throne transforms into a giant crawling claw, which belonged to, I believe, this zombie giant that attacks you on the way to the cave, which is kind of cool. By the way, this entire anthology is designed for levels 1 through 10, and each adventure lists the general level that it's used for. I wish that was actually listed here on the table of contents. That'd be a really nice at a glance to look at, because they really do range from like level 9, a couple of them are like level 2 or 3, and obviously that's a huge difference. I think most of them kind of fall in that sweet spot of like levels 4 to 8, which is, let's face it, when a lot of D&D is played. But I was impressed that there are some higher level being, levels 8, 9, 10-ish for horror, because I think, obviously it's easier to do horror when the players are less powerful, and thus you can, obviously just scare them with really powerful creatures. So I thought that was actually pretty impressive, and this one is one of them that's 8th level, that you can do more horror-themed adventures with higher level, or at least tier 2 level adventures, which is pretty cool. Also, a lot of really unique monsters, and most of the adventures utilize unique monsters with new stat blocks, which is really cool to see. As I mentioned, like really impressive appendices. This one actually has an entire appendix for the town, which is not really even used in this adventure necessarily. This adventure is extremely short and linear, where you go to the person's manor and you discover the clues of their disappearance, and then you move on to the docks, and there's a bunch of combat encounters, and then you get to the cave, and there's not a whole lot of actual interaction with the town itself, but if you wanted to, then there's a whole appendix here with the information there. And then this is an example of what the maps look like. So I'm glad we got grid maps of the areas that would seem like that. You don't even need a grid map for the mansion, you're just looking at clues. But as you can see, I don't think the blood theme really works here. It's just too dark and muddy, and it's hard to distinguish things, and I don't know, I would have preferred just a normal looking ass map. So it's not a style I like, and unfortunately this is kind of repeated throughout each of almost all of them have this very similar art style that I'm not a huge fan of, but I am glad that we at least got some visualization. And some of the adventures, it's very, very nice that we got maps for them, because they are basically big dungeon crawls. Like this one, which is the Mad Lab of Dr. Zachariah. This is obviously similar to the Island of Dr. Moreau, which is the classic mad scientist, which is creating a bunch of horrible mutant monsters. And I think this is a really, really cool subject matter to explore for D&D. In this case, it's a mad druid and his assistant, and they're both really cool characters throughout. And you basically go through this big dungeon, there's a bunch of mutated monsters and just nastiness everywhere. You could actually show up to the doctor's office, wait in the waiting room, and then he takes you back for surgery. It's all really messed up, but also kind of fun if you want to engage in that. And then there's actually notes at the end if you want to go through with the actual, here we go, the body modifications. You can totally submit yourself, and then it gives you the ability, but also has a flaw to it as well, so it's not just a straight upgrade. There's definitely some to kind of go with the theme that yes, you can get mutated powers, but they come at a great cost. It's the whole body horror aspect. So I think this is a pretty cool adventure I liked quite a bit. It basically boils down to a pretty interesting dungeon crawl. Also, I loved the description of one of the creatures, which was the parasite, spelled with a Y. Surprisingly intelligent. This reminds me of the Thing, by the way. The body of a panther with 6 spindly giant spider legs and an elongated neck that blossoms into an umbrella of over a dozen grasping rodent-like arms. The parasite prefers to mentally enslave a creature, then crawl inside it and extend its legs throughout the inside of its body like puppet strings for additional control, wearing its host like fleshy armor. That's great. That's fucking gross and great, and I love it. So I like that whole concept. You can see here, very nice that we got some visualization. It's basically a bunch of cells with monsters in them, and you kind of fight your way through everything. But the assistant's a fun character. The boss is a fun character. They can morph themselves at the end, and there's a bunch of, just a nasty body horror theme throughout, which is cool. Gorwick's Glorious Gore Fest is the classic horror circus. This one is done pretty literally like a circus, where you are transported, and you are told to gather 3 coins, and there are 4 or 5 different events you can do, and each one gives you a coin when you complete it. So it's kind of non-linear, and you basically just do all these little events. I wish there were more like actual mini game. Well, I guess they're like circus game, like kind of carnival games. One of them you're like throwing hatchets at a target, but if you miss, they come back and hit you. One of them you're walking across a bunch of high planks, like a tightrope walk, but then there's some sprites that like attack you. Basically, they're all supposed to be dark and messed up and very dark humor and painful and all that. As you make it through here. This, honestly, the whole thing seems kind of just annoying, and maybe not. You'd have to play this one very, very well as a DM to not just piss off your players constantly, because it is really designed to wear them out and just constantly berate them and bring them down with all the stuff they do, and that's part of the idea, but it seems like you would have to be very careful to not be overly cruel and really sap the fun out of this adventure, and then it eventually boils down to a final boss fight with the ringmaster himself and his pet displacer beast, which I do think it's funny that he tells the players if they can steal certain items from him, then that will complete the combat encounter, in addition to just beating his ass senseless, and the players can't use an action to grab it, but of course he'll teleport away and the monster is right there, so kind of a cool side thing for the final boss fight. Let's see. I have to, by the way, look at my notes constantly because with 12 adventures, I just had to write shit down. There was just too much to cover. Sangwood Forest is a good example of an adventure that was fine. It wasn't... The problem with this one is it's the classic dark forest. There's the town is in bad times, and there's a dark forest nearby, and something's bad is happening in the forest. And it's just all fairly obvious. There's not a real, shocking thing to uncover or unfold. And this might be a consequence of just reviewing too many adventures where I see too many concepts of the Dark Forest. It's very well worn even in D&D by now. And in this case, you basically go there and it's there's a heart of the forest, there's a bunch of dryads. They're like, oh yeah, the humans are encroaching upon us and we need to fight back. It just felt all very obvious. So that's kind of the takeaway. It's not bad in any way. But maybe it's just to me that I'm kind of broken that I've seen this too many times. But I've seen the whole Dark Forest, and it didn't surprise me at all. The one interesting thing that it does, and the designer buries it in this appendix, in this random table that can happen, and it's such a cool thing that you should not bury this, which is during the night, one of the characters can be surrounded and taken away by will-o-wisps and just kidnapped, and they're replaced by a doppelganger. And you're supposed to whisper this as the DM to the player, by the way, you're now a doppelganger as part of the party, and it's supposed to be just completely normal, but then when you get to the very last battle, your actual character will be captured, and then you will be revealed as a doppelganger, and I would let the player just fight as that doppelganger. That's freaking amazing. That is a huge, awesome twist, a cool horror moment. You have to include that. You can't just bury that as this is going to happen on a D6 if the overnight, if this. No, that has to happen. That's an amazingly cool thing. Don't bury your best ideas in random tables. Absolutely not. I love that, and I would definitely do it. The Whitestone Affair, this one is a missing person, which is, I think, works out better than the first one's missing person. There's more of a series of clues and investigations you have to do. You have to go to the guy's workplace, and you have to go speak to his wife, and his wife is either kidnapped or was attemptedly kidnapped by him because he's been brainwashed by a evil god and then has basically started up his own cult. And that part all goes in a kind of an obvious direction, but the interesting thing about this one is it actually has 2 very divergent paths depending on which NPC that you want to enlist as your helper. And if you enlist one of them, he suggests you go talk to this person, and then that leads to its own dungeon. And then the other person suggests you talk to this captured demon, and that leads to its own dungeon. And then both of those give the information you need to then go to Act 3. So it's very interesting the way Act 2 is completely split up between 2 mutually exclusive areas. You usually don't see this kind of game design in anything, because when you're making something, you want your players to be able to experience all of the things. And in this case, there's actually two very divergent paths. I do think one of them is a lot more interesting than the other one, though. It's a beholder in disguise, just kind of a charming fellow. The other one ends up being a captured demon that kind of is written in a way that the party doesn't really have too many choices at, which is a little annoying, and I don't think the dungeon is quite as interesting. It's kind of just a bandit cave, I guess. It's an abandoned mansion full of bandits. And then the third act, you actually find the guy and just kind of defeat him, and that part's kind of the same. But I thought that middle act was interesting, the way it's breaks off between those two very separate paths. I am going to end up going through all of these, aren't I? Because it's interesting to talk about them. Let's see. Verdant Growth is possibly one of my favorites of this adventure. This one reminded me of Resident Evil, which I don't play those games because I'm kind of a wuss when it comes to horror, but I have seen a few of the movies. Except with plants. So there's a blood plague that has transformed everyone into plants. In this case, it is one single monstrous plant, which was, an alchemist stole from this herbalist and created this concoction, and this thing grew into this giant plant, and it can kill people and then create all these bloody plant monsters that are just attacking, and the town is like, there's nobody in the town except there's just monsters everywhere. It's very like zombie-like, which I think is really cool. It's a theme that I always like seeing in D&D, and I think the plant concept makes it new and gives it a new twist. There's a cool, Mila Jovovich-style hero that can help the party and kind of explain what's going on. And ultimately, the only part I didn't like about this is I was really expecting the actual final dungeon to be a dungeon, but it's really not. It's basically a single room. Like once you've basically kind of destroyed the things in the town and done some searching, then just one of the alchemist lab, which you'll figure out pretty quickly, that's the one. You just go down there and basically kill the bloodroot layer. So it's almost a little too short. I was hoping this would be a little bit more of a dungeon, because I think it's a really cool idea with a cool theme and really interesting monsters you can see, of which are all unique stat blocks. Let's see, Roots of the Elk Meyer. This is another forest one, and unfortunately it's also just not quite as interesting. This one has another evil creature that lurks. It started off interesting with the town that needed to sacrifice like a child every so often in order to prosper, and I thought that's an interesting concept that I've seen before in certain stories and movies. But then it kind of abandons that, because you immediately find the child and you find this druid that basically explains, oh, there's just a monster lurking in there that we need to go take out, and you have to go take out. You have to go kill these totems and shrines to destroy it. So I thought the beginning started off good, but then it kind of just abandons that and just turns into more just traditional kind of hunt through the forest fighting these things. So again, not bad, but not super interesting. Corrupted Veins is one of the only ones that actually takes place in a cave, surprisingly. This one I thought had a really fun mix of puzzles and exploration as you kind of discover what happened to this previous people that had uncovered these magic gems, and there's this beast that ends up controlling them, and there's this interesting history here that the party can experience via these like cutscenes that happen if they failed these saving throws, which I would kind of just do the cutscenes. I'm not even sure I would rely on a saving throw, because I think they're really cool, and I love that storytelling trope of the players experiencing backstory via like these visions, and maybe even allowing some interactivity to where you can see them happening like hologram style. That works really well for horror too, because it comes with like ghosts or stuff like that. And I think it's more interesting than doing the classic like journal entry thing, for example, just finding everybody always writes journal entries in games so you can figure out what's going on. And I always really like the fact that when you can like see things happen right in front of you is cool, and it uses that throughout, which is really cool. So I like that one. Shrine of Fallen Snow is similar to the last one, which is Blood of the Ancients, where I thought was actually a misstep for this anthology and didn't feel like it actually fit in this anthology. Yes, it eventually involves first of all, it's got several pages of dialogue, which you don't need this much information. Once you actually get to this exotic frozen area, which is, again, not... You can do that in horror, certainly. I mean, The Thing does that, and, that's a thing, but... but in this case, you just go out here, there's all these different things going on, you're not sure what's going on, and then it's just this demon who can disguise itself and then hunts you. Maybe it's supposed to be like a little predatory, but instead it's more of a I don't know. And it was really strange because it's designed for first and second level, and it's not at all plays out like that. Like this horrible demon can kill you pretty easily at CR7, or this frost giant princess can show up and save you as a Deus Ex Machina, which isn't fun for anybody to just get their asses kicked by a demon and then have this NPC show up. So not really a fan of this one as much. This one, and again the last one, which is Blood of the Ancients, which takes place in, let's see, I can skip ahead to that one, in fact. Wrote down the page numbers. Which takes place in the jungles of Mazdaca, which is an area I've not really seen or heard from in any of the DM's Guild adventures I've been reviewing, which involves just a vampire cult uprising in the ruins. It just feels very like Tomb of Annihilation-y and kind of jungle crawling, and not horror like the others are horror. So those two just feel very out of place compared to the other adventures. And then we've got, whoops, did I hit number lock? Why are my numbers not working? Let's see, 1. Nope. I've lost control of my numbers. Oh no. I have to scroll through this. Alright, let's scroll. The Houses of Sacrifice. This one is Cabin in the Woods. I would very recommend watching the movie Cabin in the Woods if you've never seen it before. It's an amazing deconstruction of the classic, like, slasher horror genre in the most part. Really, really awesome movie. I'm hesitant to even spoil it, although I think they talk about basically what's going on fairly early on. But in this story, it takes that basic concept of God, how much do I spoil here? So it doesn't exactly do Cabin in the Woods. It lures the players to this mansion by giving them a quest. And then when they're there, they invite them to dinner, and then the woman announces, "Oh, you are the latest sacrifice." You know, it kind of starts off as a classic cult thing. It's like, you are the latest sacrifices. But then they disappear, and just a bunch of monsters show up and attack the players. And they're in the middle of this mansion with just monsters spawning everywhere all the time. So it kind of turns into this giant combat gauntlet as the players explore this area and get harried constantly and try to figure out what's going on. And then eventually they find their way into the basement and the control room, and they find all the cells with the monsters in there that they're summoning. And the order is there because they have to... they're doing it for a specific reason, which is very similar to exactly like Cabin in the Woods' reason. So this is one of my favorite adventures because I love seeing that concept translated into D&D. It's a little too combat focused. I wish there was a little more... there's a little bit of exploration involved with finding out the stories and stuff, but maybe a little more like puzzles and traps oriented rather than just straight having combat occur constantly in all of these different rooms. But it's still a really cool situation and just a really fun idea for using a really cool movie into a D&D tabletop adventure. This one also uses a lot of extra monsters, which is kind of cool and kind of bad. It's cool because we get cool monsters from Volos and Mordenkainen's. It's bad because it doesn't list any of those stat blocks, and if you don't have those books, you're kind of screwed. Because I don't believe it says if you don't have this, you can use this. So it's an interesting way of using all those really cool monsters, but hopefully you've got those books. And then there's the map. So a couple of the maps are different. I guess this doesn't use the blood one. This one, and then there was one other one. That might have been the one I haven't done yet, Crimson Well, that didn't use that same map style. So there is some. But although this one is still to where... Basically, when I look at a map, I see, can I put this on a virtual tabletop? And this I can't. This is just DM only. You know, there's words in there. There's no detail. It lets me as the DM be able to visualize stuff, which is helpful, but I can't actually use this for my players, for example. The Crimson Well is way too long. I was honestly just lost in trying to figure out what was going on in this adventure. It compared, the others are between 12 and 20, maybe 25 pages long, not including their appendices. The Crimson Well, not including its appendix, is 40 pages. Over 40 pages is what I wrote down. That was one of my main notes I wrote down. It's over 40 pages long. There's way too much story going. I mean, it's interesting. There's this whole people, and they're trying to hide like who they are. It's got the classic town that's very strict and overbearing. So it's got some neat ideas. There's a trial that they can pass or fail, and either way they end up basically in the dungeon they need to go to. But I mean, it's way too long, and it relies way too heavily on random encounters. There's too much story, too much lore for me at least, especially when it comes to a mini adventure. If you want to expand this into a full-fledged adventure, then and include all these notes and things and appendices, then fine. But for the purposes of these mini adventure anthologies, this one just felt way too long and just too bursting with lore and story compared to all the others, to where it was keeping it snappy and keeping all the information, easy for me to parse. So this one was just a little bit much for me. Although I think the maps were probably these had the best maps though, for sure. None of them were actually grid maps, but they had really good maps of the overhead view of the area, which was a nice way to visualize everything. And I think that actually covers all 12 of the mini adventures. So let's go over my pros and cons for Bloodties Anthology Volume 1. Pros: 12 horror-themed mini adventures with a variety of sub-genre themes and tropes. We had the exotic adventures in extreme environments. We had the dark forests, the looming forest next to the simple towns. We had a bunch of murder mysteries. We had some dark cults and dark gods. We had the evil circus. There was a lot of just good things happening on here. The only one I think we didn't get was a straight-up slasher. I don't know if we ever got a straight-up slasher one. That was missing. Pro: each adventure is well organized, including plot hooks, adventure summaries, and grid maps. I do appreciate the way everything seems to have a uniform style, which is something I'm very much looking for whenever you're creating a collection of adventures. Don't make it to where every adventure has a very distinct way of organizing all of their content, for example, and looks different. You need to make them all look uniformly similar and then have them all structured similarly, so it's easy for me to look at each part of the information for each adventure, and it just makes everything look nice and clean together. Pro: most adventures include lengthy appendices detailing monster stat blocks, encounter tables, or additional lore information. I was very impressed because usually with these kind of adventures, you don't get much in the way of appendices. When it comes to the anthology ones or mini adventures, they'll usually barely even worry about an epilogue. They'll maybe include, a stat block or two, maybe a magic item. This one, almost all of them have new creatures. Some of them have new magic items. A lot of them have different, lore. There was maps on there. Really, really impressive how each one really expanded on what they, even on the ones that only were like a dozen pages long, then they still have like a dozen pages worth of their appendices, which was impressive. Cons: for the most part, the maps were a con. I know I mentioned part of having maps in a pro, but the actual map styles and they were just kind of bare and black and white map, and mostly unattractive, with a lot of them have that blood style. I was not a fan of that. And cons: I really did think that the two in particular that were more adventure-y and exotic locations didn't quite fit the horror theme that this anthology was doing a good job of producing. So I thought that I put that down as a con. I just didn't enjoy. I thought those two adventures were weaker in general, but also because they didn't fit the theme quite as strongly. Final verdict: from dark forests to evil gods and mutant monstrosities, Bloodties Anthology Volume 1 features a consistent quality of horror-themed mini-adventures. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.